when we left off, what did we cover last time? The 2 elections and the Compromise of 1850, right?
And for the Nashville Convention.
Oh, and the Nashville Convention, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it was the time before that, the election. Before the election.
Yeah.
The Nashville Convention,
And then
crisis and compromise,
and election.
Election 52. Okay, good. All right. Well, so this, I mean, you could list this as a separate outline section or whatever. It's all the same stuff. I'd kind of separate it in this class because it gets long if you don't. Because it makes it easier to study, I think. So basically, that other section was kind of the aftermath of the Mexican War, compromise in the elections, right? What we have here is essentially well, it's not snapshots because it would take us weeks. More like a deep dive into the 1850s, I guess. We'll do what we always do. I'll tell you about the event, a series of stories, what happened, what's significant, right? Usual stuff. But with the added dimension of asking yourself each time, how does this help divide North and South even more, right? The way I always phrase this, very simple, it's not complex at all, is they compromised in 50, and 11 years later, you have the Civil War. So somehow in 1850, they compromise, 11 years later, begin the deadliest war in American history that kills 750,000 people, 750,000 people. So seems reasonable to ask what the heck happened in the 1850s, right? So I'm going to walk through a series of events. I'd like to do at least 2 today, maybe 3. And I want to kind of get a pretty decent schedule going here because that way, if we're on pace, maybe we cannot have class the Tuesday of Thanksgiving if we're on pace. Unless I scheduled something for that. I don't know, I'll look at it. I just realized I may have scheduled something for that. Anyway, all right, let us start with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Do what I always do here, tell you the story and everything, but I'm gonna, down there on the bottom, I'm gonna try to get you guys to do some of the work instead of me. Let us start with the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe. So, it's important, I think you know this, I don't think you need me to tell you this. Anything you read, anytime ever, you need to pay attention to who wrote it. It's like if you see something in the news or online, you need to pay attention to who's putting it out there. And that's not being cynical, it's not being smart aleck, it's true. You need to know who's, what's that old phrase, consider the source. And it doesn't have to be a negative thing. It doesn't have to be negative at all, you just need to know who's writing. In this case, it's relevant to say, so we're about to talk about a book that's about slavery. The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was an abolitionist. She didn't particularly like that label because of the radical connotations, but she was an abolitionist, as was her husband, as were her parents, and as was her famous brother. You're going to see all this. I think it's the first chapter that you'll read in the 1850s book. It's pretty well done. It's a short chapter, so you'll get a lot more about her. So she's a Northerner, she's an abolitionist, she was raised by abolitionists, she married an abolitionist, her brother's a famous abolitionist. Nothing wrong with any of that. It just means you're about to hear about a book written about slavery by someone who hated slavery, right? 2 other things to point out in her case. One thing is we know that, yeah, they're abolitionists and they hate slavery and all that, but it's also clearly true that her family, what really bothered them was the fugitive slave law, that part of the Compromise of 1850. The idea that you could recapture escaped slaves who make it into free territory or free states, that seems to be kind of the trigger that set her off to go ahead and do something. And supposedly, I shouldn't say, I don't mean to sound dismissive, but the family history tells us that what prompted her to write the book is that supposedly a family member said something to her along the lines of, hey, you have this great gift, this storytelling ability. You should use it to advance your cause, right? You have this cause that you believe in, trying to stamp out slavery. you have this remarkable talent, shouldn't you use it? Right? Okay. Let's do a quick overview right here as far as what's going on, what's she trying to do, that sort of thing. And then we'll illustrate it. I always say it like this anytime I'm explaining this to somebody, whether it's a class or anything else. I point out a few things. Number one, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel. And of course, by definition, a novel means what?
It's fiction.
It's fiction. A novel is fiction. Now, again, that's not a value judgment. It's not dismissive. It's fiction. Fiction can be with a purpose. It can be historical fiction. It can be fiction based on reality, right? So to call it fiction is not to insult it, but it is fiction. Now, I always like to present it this way. It's quite clear if you read the book and put it in the context of the 1850s. She has two goals with this book, two purposes, however you want to put it. One very general, one a great deal more specific. The general one, you already know what it is. We've talked about the abolitionists before. The general goal is to kind of shine a light on slavery, to make it as relevant as possible, to raise awareness, whatever generic phrase you want to use there, right? Again, flashback to our Missouri Compromise talk, how, people would, out of sight, out of mind, I know it's bad, but I don't see it, et cetera, et cetera. So if she's thinking, if she can write this, really big, successful, famous book, then this will get everybody's attention. And if it becomes really widely circulated, she may or may not win you over, but you won't be able to plead ignorance anymore. You will have heard these stories. You will have read these stories. So that's goal number one. Try to make this thing a national thing. Try to get it in the press. Get people talking about it. Raise awareness. The second goal is more specific, and as we're going to see, will become more problematic in terms of creating controversy. And the second goal is to humanize the subject. To humanize the subject of slavery. Meaning, I know it's probably obvious, but let me go ahead and say it. She understands that a lot of people, when they think of slavery in this country at the time, they think of it as a political issue, which it was, but she wants you to think of it as more than that. She knows that a lot of people just think in terms of, hey, slavery's a bad deal, but I don't know much about it. It's some abstract thing that politicians talk about in Washington, And it's clear one of her great goals in the book is to say, no, these are real people. You need to understand it's real people on all, in all facets of this. Slaves are people, slaveholders are people. This is real. It's not just a political issue. It is a political issue, but it's not just a political issue. And so she's thinking, and I think you can see this coming, she's thinking, if I can create characters that people relate to or sympathize with, then I'm going to get inside your head, and I'm going to get you to pay attention. Right? Okay. Those appear to be the goals of the book. Now I have 1852 on the screen. She is published as a book in 1852. What she actually did is she started initially publishing it in what they call serial form. So she put part of it in a newspaper, each week, right, and then put them all together as one book. So that started in 51, but 52 is when it became a big deal as a book. Right? Okay, the characters. I like to choose these three characters. I profile these in every class. To me, this is the best way to illustrate what she's doing in the book. Now, I'm always careful to say this. I approach this as a Civil War historian. I'm not an English lit or American lit person. In this case, American lit. So there's no symbolism. I'm not going to try to tell you what the tree by the river means. I don't know. I'm going to tell you what it seems to me from historical context she's trying to do with these three characters. Most of it's obvious, not all. Character number one, start with the obvious place, and that is Tom. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Tom is the title character. He is also, quite clearly, the hero of the book, no doubt. Tom is the hero of the book. He's a slave, he's an adult male slave. He is, throughout the book, well, throughout the part of the book that he's alive, he is portrayed as basically just everything you want a man to be. Big, strong guy, he's smart, he's courageous, he's kind to everybody. There's the famous scene where he dives in the raging river to save the drowning child. Right? Literary criticism types like to tell you that it's an intentional Christ-like portrayal. I don't know about all that, but I know it's easy to see that she's at least clearly making him the hero you're supposed to admire and look up to this guy, right? He's everything you want a guy to be, right? But of course, what happens to Tom is he is beaten to death. He suffers this horrible, violent death at the hands of not only the slaveholder, but the other slaves. They gang up on him. He's beaten to death. He's beaten to death because he was told to do something. It's the only time in the book that he was not obedient. He was told to punish some other slaves. He wouldn't do it, and so he received the punishment. This is why today, in 1852, Tom is the hero of the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, but Uncle Tom today is an insult, right? What's that phrase mean now? You ever hear that one? Somebody's called an Uncle Tom. What's it mean? It's not an accident. It's not random.
Like a black guy agreeing with white people.
It's a black guy who is too quick to please white people. Yeah. And one black person will call another black person Uncle Tom. Right? Well, it's not necessarily meant to disparage the character in the book, except in the sense that Tom was kind to everyone, white and black. He was obedient. He always did what he was told, except for one time. But in case you're wondering, how can he be the hero of the book and now it's an insult? That's why. All right, so Tom, your hero of the book, is suffers this horrible, horrible fate. Which leads us to our second character, logical place to go at that point. A man named Simon Legree, L-E-G-R-E-E, Simon Legree. Simon Legree is the villain of the book. He's the bad guy. He's the guy you're supposed to hate. And if indeed you read this book, you will hate him. He's a slave owner. He's responsible for Tom's death. But he's just a vile, profane, violent, just an unlikable person, you know. And just page after page, you're like, man, this guy's awful. Exactly, that's the point, right? He's supposed to be the bad guy. He's supposed to be the villain. You're not supposed to like this guy. Here's the thing. So with Legree, I always phrase it this way. Again, this is a historian looking at it, not a literature scholar. There are two things about the Legree character that I would argue are kind of surprised. Not shocking, but a little bit of a curveball. The first one, and this ties back to our purposes. The first kind of surprise about the Legree character is that although, yes, he is the southern slave owner, the plantation owner, etc., he is not a native southerner. He's a northern transplant. Okay, so this is a guy who was born and raised in the north, and he migrates to the south as a grown man and intentionally becomes involved in this. Well, I think she did that. I mean,
it makes him even worse because he he wasn't born into it.
Exactly, and I think there are a couple of points. Yeah, I think you're right. A couple of points to be made there. One is, you can't give if you were an apologist reading the book, you can't give him the Legree built-in excuse. say, well, gosh, he was born and raised in central Louisiana. He's a fourth generation slave owner. What do you think he's going to be? It's all he's known. You can't say that with LeGree. I think the other reason she did that, this thing about him being a northern transplant, is despite how it might look on the surface, if you read the book, I won't even say carefully, if you're just paying attention when you read it, she's trying to make the point throughout the book that it's not really the Southern people who are the problem. It's the institution of slavery that's the problem. So slavery is the evil. In fact, it's so bad, it corrupted a guy who wasn't born and raised into it. It corrupted a guy who grew up where there was no slavery. Right? So I think that's why, again, not letting him have the excuse, and to point out that the real evil is slavery, not the person. I think that's why she makes him more of a transplant. Here's the other curveball. I said there were two surprises about LeGree. The other one is later in the book, you can kind of start to see that Stowe gives LeGree just a little bit of a conscience. A little bit. Not much. Don't misconstrue this. It's not a, she doesn't redeem him. He doesn't become a good guy at the end of the book. He doesn't have a come to Jesus moment. He doesn't have an eye opening. It's not an ABC after school special. Right? Or tonight on a very special blossom. You guys old enough to remember those? No. Shit, I gotta get new jokes, man.
Well,
I'm gonna retire. No, huh? The first one, yeah. So,
Yeah.
what used to happen in the 80s is on all the sitcoms you'd watch in the 1980s, once a year, every show would have the really serious episode. And they call it Tonight on a Very Special. Okay, never mind.
See, they still have them, they just don't call it Tonight on a Very Special.
Oh.
Well, now we stream everything, so it's not like Tonight on a Very Special. It's you
Whenever
just
you-
watching the series.
whenever
and
you
whenever
click
you
it,
get to
yeah.
it, yeah. Whenever you get to it and you start the episode, you're like, oh shit, this is kind of.
Okay, fair enough. Well, they used to do, it'd be like stupid sitcom, and episode 18 is, oh, so-and-so's friend is drinking in high school. Oh, what are we going to do?
Like the if I dare people just.
Yeah. Except every once in a while, man, it's crazy because there was a Different Strokes episode where there was a child molester. Why is this on Different Strokes? And he gets one of them. You didn't watch Different Strokes?
Too young.
Yeah, update your references.
I don't have any new references.
Yeah, get some new references.
I don't want new ones.
Shows today aren't good anyways.
I don't even watch TV anymore except sports. Anyway, so she doesn't redeem Simon LeGree. You're all missing out, man.
Yeah, see, drugs aren't the biggest issue. It's now depression's the biggest issue that's talked about. Yeah. But those are literally it.
You know who has anxiety? Every human who's ever lived. You're not special. You're fine. Suck it up and stop self-diagnosing. It's called, damn, something unpleasant happened today. Okay, anyway, there's that. I guess I just diagnosed too, so I shouldn't. I just diagnosed you. I shouldn't have done that. All right. Anyway, back to my stupid story here. She doesn't redeem him completely. He has a little bit of a conscience, but not enough of a conscience to, correct his ways, but enough to kind of question himself, question what he's doing. To me, and I can't know this, she doesn't state it explicitly, but I think it's clear why she's doing that. Again, slavery is the enemy, not necessarily the Southerner. I think her point is, look, she's an abolitionist. She's trying to abolish this horrible institution. She's trying to, in her way, in her vision, save the country. So she really can't afford to portray the Southerners as beyond redemption. Right? If she just flat out says, well, they're horrible people and they're a lost cause, well, then the rest of the country is going to say, then why are you writing a stupid book? Why do we need to listen to abolitionists? Why have you been chirping for 30 years? Right? If they're a lost cause, Well, they don't like you, they're not gonna change. So she needs to present the idea that they can change. So she gives him a little bit of a conscience, so she presents that idea without letting him off the hook. Pretty clever. By the way, just like, this is ridiculous, but just like Uncle Tom has entered kind of the American lexicon, in the past, so did Simon Legree. Nobody really says this anymore, but it used to be a pretty common reference. You'd see it in movies, you'd hear people, well, you wouldn't, but apparently those of us from earlier eras would hear, Simon Legree became a very common term for a boss you didn't like. That's a bit much. People say, man, that old guy's a real Simon Legree. You don't really hear it anymore, probably just because, people don't read anymore. But also, might be a bit inappropriate. I'm not sure the violent, murderous slave owner is quite the same as your shift manager at Pizza Hut. Do what you will. Anywho, all right, that's Tom and that's Legree. One more character, I like to include her. I think you have to. If you see anything about Uncle Tom's Cabin, you will see the character of Eliza. And Eliza is a female slave. She's a young adult. She has a child. He's, I can't remember, 5 or 6. It's been years since I sat down and read it. I think he's about 5 or 6. His name's Harry. Well, Eliza is at the center of what are without question the most famous scenes in the book, not in closing. There's a sequence of events, covers multiple chapters with what happens with Eliza. They're more famous than Tom's death scene, honestly. So a little bit of context, right? And you'll see this fits right in with our 1850s storyline. So Eliza, the part of the story where, at least where this starts, is she's in Kentucky. She lives on a plantation in Kentucky, and that is not random, that is not an accident. That's by design. But remember what we said at the top. We said one of the things that really angered the Stowe family was the fugitive slave law. And one of the states that had a great reputation for helping escaped slaves was Ohio. Ohio, of course, is right across the Ohio River from Kentucky. So none of this is random. It's clearly all by design, which is fine. It's not a bad thing. I think some of you know this. I mention it in every class in case you haven't, if you ever get a chance to go. There are museums about this all over the country, but what is considered the national official museum of the Underground Railroad is in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is right on the Ohio River looking across at Kentucky. It's not an accident, right? Okay, so Eliza then is this young female slave. She lives in Kentucky. Now, she has not experienced the violence that Tom has. As you saw in Campbell's book, the slavery book, there are different kinds of conditions that people live with, right? She has not faced that kind of horrible life, but she's about to face something potentially worse. So what happens is there's a scene that kicks it off where another slave comes to Eliza late at night. It's about midnight, thereabouts. This slave comes to Eliza and says, "Hey, I just overheard something. I just overheard a conversation. It's awful. It's terrible." They overheard the slave owner having a conversation with some guy they didn't know. And as it turns out, the slave owner, they say he's having financial troubles, and he's going to have to sell some slaves. And this person tells Eliza, "Hey, look, I didn't stay for the whole conversation, but I heard what I heard, and I got out of there. I had to tell you. Because what I heard is they were negotiating, and they're going to sell either you or your son, or they're not selling both of you." So it's midnight and she has just been told that, and by the way, they're coming at 6 o'clock in the morning. So she's just been told in 6 hours, somebody is coming to separate you from your child forever. And there's a famous paragraph in the book where she, Stowe, kind of, it's like what they, in movies and television, they call breaking the fourth wall, where the actor looks at you and talks to the camera. Harriet Beecher Stowe does that. And she says, she actually calls you reader. She says, hey, or she says, you reader. She says, what I want you to do is imagine if this were you. Someone knocked on your door at midnight and said at 6 o'clock, someone's coming to take your child. And Stowe says, what would you do? And she says, you know what you would do. You'd grab your kid and you'd run. And she says, that's what Eliza did. So Eliza grabs her son and she takes off running in the woods. And here we go, kind of tying it back to the history of the 1850s again. She has known her whole life that Ohio was on the other side of that river. And getting across the river didn't guarantee anything. As you know, fugitive slave law, she could be recaptured. But Ohio is a free state. It has a reputation for helping. Not everyone, not most people, of course, but there are white and black people in southern Ohio who will help you if you can get across. She's been told that her whole life. She's also been told her whole life that in the wintertime, the Ohio River has there's a bend in it right there, and in the wintertime it will freeze. You can go across the ice. So she says, well, I have to try. So she scoops him up and she runs. And of course, you know, as you're reading in these pages, the drama's building, it's dark, it's snowing, she's running. She, you know, she can't carry a 5-6-year-old very long, so it slows her down, but she has to stop. He can't keep up, so she's got to pick him up again. She's struggling, but she's got to run. In her mind, she's, well, literally running for her life, basically. So she's making it through, and now this part of the book, she tells you kind of subtly, I guess it's foreshadowing. She says it's kind of in that period where you're transitioning from winter to spring. It's dark, it's snowing, it's cold, but it's not freezing cold. So she runs and she runs and she runs and she gets to the river, and when she gets there, it's not frozen. Of course, it is the Ohio River. This is a massive river. You're not going to swim it. Certainly not going to swim it in the winter with a child on your back, right? Well, at one point, as she's nearing the river, she sees it's not frozen. She realizes they've discovered her absence, and she hears men coming after her. They have dogs. They're on horseback. They're going to track her down. Obviously, she can't outrun all of that. The river's not frozen, so what does she do? Well, famously, she can't run across the ice, she can't swim it, so she puts young Harry on her back. She crawls from one chunk of ice to the other, and she makes it. She gets across the river into Ohio. Eventually she finds help. Later makes it all the way to Canada, where later she is even reunited with her husband. Okay. Well, let's look at the reaction to the book then. As with so many things in the 50s, the significance lies in how various groups reacted to it. Let's start with the Northerners, because that's easy. The Northern reaction is simple. You can see it coming. To me, really all you got to do is assess how she did on the 2 goals, raising awareness and humanizing the subject. As far as raising awareness, well, gosh, one of the most widely read books of the 19th century. I think mission accomplished on that. It was wildly popular. Most people read it or read parts of it, or you saw it performed on the stage. Traveling theater troops performed this. And so the goal was to basically, to put slavery in the forefront, so that you couldn't escape it. So you'd have to think she's successful on that, right? In fact, it's even said, this will come up a couple of times the rest of the semester for us, it's even said that so many people related to the book and were sympathetic that, I think one way I saw it phrased, it brought abolitionism to the edge of respectability. In other words, no, she didn't make the whole country abolitionist. That's ridiculous. But it softened their image a little bit. Now, they're still the radicals. They're still seen as extremists, even in the North, not just among the South, even the North. Remember, the Northerners would look at abolitionists and say, you know, your heart's in the right place, but you're just going too far. You can't be thrown around such strong language. Well, this book is so successful that they're still the radicals, but the perception is softened a bit. The other goal was to humanize the subject. Well, good grief, obviously she did that. Because people related to these characters. And for example, now when they think of a slave, well, they might think of Tom, the great heroic Tom. Or maybe they think of Eliza. Or maybe they think of Eliza's tribe. So that's good. That's what she wanted. You'll stop thinking in abstract political terms and start thinking in human terms. But therein also lies part of the problem. Because we have to consider the Southern reaction. I'm gonna see if I can get you guys to fill in the gap here. I know it's Thursday and you're tired. But the Southerners, of course, hate the book. They hate it. They're angered by it. What I want to do is I want to look at what are the Southern criticisms of the book, and then her response to their criticism, right? And this is one of those and other things like with the slavery book. You know, you got to like issue 9,000 disclaimers. The Southerners are going to raise some objections to the book. They're not wrong in some of their objections. Doesn't mean they're right in what they believed in practice, it's not the point. But they raised some meaningful points. It's just that she's going to come back with an answer and win the argument rather easily. Okay? If you're a Southerner, you guys have now read a book about slavery, if you started, you're reading more. What's one of your objections?
Not everyone treats their slaves like that.
It's kind of propagandistic, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
she's obviously trying to push her point of view through the story.
Yeah, so both of you are right. So let's take both of your answers. There's the first one. The South says basically it's a book about slavery written by a woman who hates slavery. What did you think she was going to say? She's an abolitionist. So is her brother. So are her parents. So is her husband. Again, fine. She's doing what she's supposed to do. But their point is, did you think this was some kind of objective research monograph or something? No. It's an attack on slavery, which, by the way, it was supposed to be. But that's what the Southerners say. This is an attack on slavery. The other thing, as Abby was saying, is correct as well. They point out, hey, well, it's that old, I like to use the old cliche. Maybe no one uses this anymore. Painting with a broad brush.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Painting with a broad brush. The idea that you're overgeneralizing, you're stereotyping. In other words, a lot of Southerners said, hang on a second, 75% of us are not slave owners. And of the 25% who are, they're not all Simon Legree. Well, that's a fair point. So in other words, they're concerned that, look, people read this book and they're going to think all white Southerners are Simon Legree. Well, Legree and people like Legree are technically a minority of a minority. They're the violent minority of the minority who were slave owners. So they're saying we're not defending Legree. We're not defending him. We're pointing out in no way is this guy typical.
Was he a planter?
Yeah. Yeah, this is large scale. And then that leads to the other point that kind of ties all this together. And then this sets up her response. The Southerners say, and they're right, on the surface anyway, they say what she's done is she's taken all of the worst things that can happen in the life of a slave. Things that do happen. What happened to Tom? What almost happened to Eliza? All of the worst, horrible things that might happen to a slave, and she's put them all in one book, one story. And that creates the illusion that that's typical. So the horrible thing that happened to Tom, and the even worse thing that almost happened to Eliza, the Southerners acknowledge those things happen. But they say it's not typical. Certainly not every slave is beaten to death every day. There wouldn't be any left, thank you. So that can't be the norm. And yes, sometimes families are separated and that sucks, but we also know that most planners didn't do that. Did some? Yes, they did. Sure did. But their point is, look, you're making it look like we're all like that. And that's just not true. They have a point. However, she wrote a response. And I always tell people, if you buy a modern printing of the book, her response is usually included as an appendix in the back. And her response is probably exactly what you're expecting. She puts in there, again, she's responding to the Southern criticism. She puts in there, she says, look, I never once said that what happened to Tom and Eliza is typical. Daily experience. I never said that, she said. Never said that. But she said, that's not the point. She says, I noticed you didn't deny that it happens. You just said it's not the norm. It's not typical. So what's the point? What's her point?
It does happen.
It does.
That it happens at all. She says, I noticed you didn't deny that. Even you Southerners didn't deny it. You admit it happens. So the point is, yeah, her point is, look, it happens at all, and that should bother you. This happens in your country. That should hurt you. That should bother you. Right? And then she alludes to another point that a lot of people make in slavery. Campbell made it in his book a little bit. It's more than just the severity and variety of punishment and these horrible things that can happen. The other point is, even if they don't happen to a slave daily, they have to live every day knowing it could. So imagine living every day knowing that the person who means the most to you could be taken away at any time. That's her point, right? Now, as you'll see in your readings, especially in the 1850s book, Southerners are this isn't going to go well. And a lot of the stories that sound like exaggerations we have proof on some of them. Things like Southern post offices will not mail this book, and if they suspect it's being mailed, they would open it and not deliver it. Okay. Any questions on the book? Okay. Well, what time is it? Yeah, we can do this. I was hoping to get both of these. I don't know if we'll get both. We'll at least get the Kansas-Nebraska Act out of the way. And if we can't get the Austin Manifesto today, we'll do it next week. That's another one of those a little bit lesser known things like the Nashville Convention, but since we're studying this era so closely, we should cover it. Kansas-Nebraska Act, though. So we have to take this step by step. This is easily, not even close, easily the most significant piece of legislation of the 1850s. Now, whether it's the most significant event, I don't know, so. But as far as laws that are passed, this is easily the biggest one. And it's one of the greatest controversies. It's not the greatest, there's one bigger one coming. But it's one of the greatest controversies of a controversial decade. Okay. trying to sell this here. Big deal. Okay, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Let's start with the author. The chap in the picture there, Stephen A. Douglas. A little bit on Douglas here, because you're going to see that name a ton in your reading. Douglas at this point, 1850s, is a Democrat. He's a senator from Illinois. U.S. Senate, not Illinois State Senate, big boy Senate. Democratic senator from Illinois. Douglas was, it should be, need to make this clear, he's one of the biggest names in the country. He is not a footnote. He's not a minor figure. Keep in mind, it's 54 now. Calhoun is dead. Clay is dead. This is your next generation of leadership, and Douglas is, well, quite literally one of the most famous people in the country. He's a big dog. Not a big person. He's only like 5'4", 5'5" guy, but he's a big fish, as they say. The other thing to mention, and it'll become relevant why here in a second, he has presidential aspirations. That was never a secret. He will famously run for president in 1860 is what we're talking about. So he's a big dog, and he aspires to the highest office in the land, and everyone knows it. Nothing wrong with that. But this is part of his plan. All right, so let's look at the act itself, Kansas-Nebraska Act. First, we'll define it, and we'll say why is he doing it, and then really the controversial part. So, just defining here, the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically can be broken into two pieces, two parts. First part is very simple, and simple, generic, boring. He wants to organize the rest of the Louisiana Purchase and prepare it for settlement. So all that land in the middle, what hasn't been made a state yet, what hasn't been made Indian Territory yet, the rest of that land in the middle that was the Louisiana Purchase, he wants to organize that and prepare it for settlement. And in so doing, the law calls for the creation of two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Now this is obviously bigger than present-day Kansas and Nebraska. It includes the Dakotas and everything else. So organize the rest of the Louisiana Purchase area, cut it into two territories. We're going to call them Kansas and Nebraska. That's part one. Part two. And here's where the trouble comes in. Part two is that there is a clause in the Kansas-Nebraska Act that repeals the 3630 line. The old 3630 line that had been drawn across the Louisiana Purchase from the Missouri Compromise, we've covered it a bunch, that said no slavery above the line. That line is now wiped out. So as of 1854, there is no 3630 line. And it says instead, for these territories, they will use popular sovereignty. That's not going to go well. That's not going to go well at all. All right, so again, part number one, just organize the territory for settlement. Name one of them Kansas, one of them Nebraska, no big deal. That's just logistics. Part number two is the controversy, repeal the 3630 line. And so all that land above the line that had been supposedly forever free might still be free, but it's going to be left up to a popular vote. Popular sovereignty. Okay. Why? First of all, why is he even write the law? And second, why does Douglas, a northerner, come up with the law that would repeal the line? That's controversial. Let's start with why is he even doing this? And I wouldn't normally bother you with this much, but it's the most important law of the decade, so we need to talk about why is he doing it. As I said, he wants to be president someday, and that's not a secret. He sees this as an opportunity. He says, what we want to do is we want to build a railroad across there. What would someday be transcontinental railroad? He said, we want to build a railroad across there, and of course it would connect up with his home area of Chicago, right? The railroad from Chicago to the West Coast is going to cut right through that territory. You got to have customers. You gotta have laborers, you gotta have people to build the railroad. So he says, let's organize the territory, we'll get people there to help build the railroad, right? So one motive is to get the railroad built. Also, Douglas said, hey, the railroad, man, if this works, it's gonna be great. It's gonna revolutionize transportation, connect east and west. There's a bunch of money to be made, opportunities, fantastic, right? And the thing is, you know, he says this will be so great, so much money to be made, so much opportunity. He said this will bring together North and South. Rarely has a politician been more wrong about anything ever. Now he's right about the trouble it's going to cause here in a minute. But this idea that he thought he could bring the country together with this, he missed by about as much as you missed. Because here's the thing about Douglas, it's interesting. He's one of these guys, even his critics at the time would tell you this about Douglas. He's one of the few guys left who really was a nationalist. In other words, as North and South, it gets worse and worse and worse, and everybody's only thinking about their side of the country. Douglas really is the guy, in fact, he's pretty much the last guy, who's running around telling everybody, calm down, it's one country, we'll work together, we'll fix it, we've always fixed it. He's a nationalist. And so he's thinking, look, if I can bring the country together, I can open up the West and make all this money, and I can show the American people that I can handle a difficult problem, be president someday. Yeah. That's not going to go well. Now, to be clear, and to be fair to everybody involved, Douglas included, again, he's a Democrat, he's a Northerner, he's from Illinois. He's not pro-slavery. Nobody has ever accused of him of being pro-slavery, but he's no activist either. You know, Douglas just said, you know, the expansion of slavery is really just kind of a pointless, abstract political argument. He said it's not going to go there anyway. He said the numbers are clear. Right. He said just leave it up to the residents. At least that's what he's saying for now. Okay. But that begs the question. Why is some northern politician enacting a law that is going to anger not almost everyone, but a great many people in the north? Why are you going to wipe out the 3630 line? You're taking the entire middle of the continent that was forever close to slavery, and now, well, it doesn't mean there will be slavery, but there might be, depending on who wins the elections in Kansas, right? Well, here's why he did it. Douglas, when he first proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you know, way back up here I told you on the defining it, I said there were two parts. When he first proposed it, it was only the first part. Prepare the territory, we're going to build a railroad, blah, blah, blah. Boring, no big deal, no controversy. The repeal of the line and replace it with popular sovereignty was not in there in his original proposal. Why does he add it? I think you know why he adds it.
To get people to move there.
That's part of it. That's part of it. Although, you know, it's going to draw settlers anyway. And it may draw more being a free territory. That's at least the way. But you're on the right track. He's got to get voters. He's got to get some southern voters. Just think about it. Remember, when he first proposes it, there's no repeal, there's no popular sovereignty, there's just 3631. Without the repeal, ask yourself this: if you're a Southern member of Congress, why would you vote for that? You wouldn't. You'd look foolish. You'd probably lose your job. Right? If you voted for it, remember, it's just the first part. Consider what you're doing. You would have to go to your constituents and say, hey, check it out, here's what I just did. I voted for a law that's going to use federal tax dollars, your tax dollars, to subsidize the construction of a railroad across a northern route. And it's going to create 2 new northern territories, which will become at least 2 new northern states. It's going to make millions of dollars for northerners. Vote for me. Why would you, right? So the Southern members of Congress, there's one guy in particular who went to Douglas and he said, look, politicians, we make deals. You want our votes for this law? Repeal that line, replace it with popular sovereignty, you got a deal. Douglas said, I don't like that, but I'll do it.
It also have to do with his presidential aspirations, because even if it did pass even if the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed without the repeal and popular sovereignty, once he was running for president, he wouldn't really probably get as much Southern votes because they wouldn't know that he had come up with it.
Yeah, because Southerners wouldn't really be able to say he did anything for them. That's a good point. Yeah. You're right, but I mean, just look at the raw numbers, I don't know he could have gotten it passed without him anyway. So it kind of had to have him. Yeah. Here's what he said. In fact, they quote this in your 1850s book. I think it's the title of one of the chapters or a subtitle or something. The Southerners asked for that, and Douglas says, by God, sir, you are right, and I will incorporate it in my bill, though I know it will raise a hell of a storm. So he knew what was about to happen. He knew, and he passed it anyway, or he wrote it anyway. How does it pass? Let's go to approval. It's not complicated. It passes because of an alliance or a coalition between Northern and Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats were all about it. Some of the Northern Democrats supported it. There are only two Southerners in the entire Senate who voted against it. And they only voted against it because it wasn't really an anti-South thing. They're Southerners. They voted against it because they knew the trouble was going to bring. They said it's just not worth the chaos that's about to come. But it was passed safely, securely, but it was a North-South Democrat thing. The remaining Whigs in the North didn't really want a part of it. They're almost gone anyway. They're about to become something else. So. Now here's where Douglas was right. The hell of a storm part. The Northern reaction. This is some interesting stuff. To state the obvious, the Northern reaction is overwhelmingly negative. A lot of Northerners, including, again, I'm not overselling it, they're not all abolitionists, they're not even most, but a lot of Northerners had considered the Missouri Compromise a sacred promise, a sacred pledge. Whatever else happens, that land above that line is free. Kind of like the Northwest Ordinance. The land above the Ohio River is free. We know this. So a lot of Northerners are really upset about this. In fact, some Northern Democrats lost their seats in the next congressional election. People are not happy about this. There's a famous story, it's in your book. I don't want to beat you to death with details you're going to read anyway, but I'll just give you the main idea. Famous story, Douglas goes home, or home area. He's at a hotel in Chicago, and he goes out on the balcony and he gives a speech. And he's talking to his own people. And he even kind of sweetened the crowd. I don't know if you know they do this, but well, if you paid attention the last few weeks, you know this. Politicians pay people to be in the crowd. I don't know if you knew that. They pay people to be in the crowd to smile and cheer and clap at the right points. Because the rest of us are usually, we're just kind of like, yeah, okay. Well, he did that, and it didn't work. So apparently he was on his hotel balcony giving a speech. People are yelling at him, throwing stuff at him. And it was like a late Saturday night. And remember, these are his own people. These are his own supporters. And they were shouting him down and wouldn't listen to him. He supposedly said something like this. It is now Sunday morning. I'll go to church and you can all go to hell. You can work in those two things in the same sentence. That's good stuff. Briefly, Northern newspapers were even coming after him, calling him Judas, Benedict Arnold. Right. What's interesting, though, is it did eventually, the controversy didn't die down, but the tension toward Douglas did. It did kind of soften. I think people understood, even as harsh as critics then and now have never said Douglas was pro-slavery, for goodness sake. I think what you're looking at is a politician who took a gamble and didn't work. But there were some people, and this is leading to a major political development, as we're going to see. There were some people in the North who were more upset than that, even more upset than the people yelling at him. For example, there was a congressman from Massachusetts who said, he said, if I thank God every day that Massachusetts is not a slave state, then how can I sit back and let Kansas and Nebraska become slave states? I have to do something. I can't go along with this. There's a better one. A guy we're going to talk about a couple of times in the coming days, a guy named Charles Sumner. Some of you remember Sumner and what's going to happen to Sumner. Sumner's I don't want to say too much because we're going to talk about him in great detail later. Sumner was a Massachusetts senator, big name, huge name in the country, big name, and he will be for years to come. Sumner's an abolitionist. He's not just anti-slavery, he's legitimate, big-time, hardcore abolitionist. This won't surprise you if you think about it. If he's that guy, he's from Massachusetts, he's a legit abolitionist, then obviously he hates the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You have to. Kansas-Nebraska Act does not spread slavery, but it reopens the possibility of the spread of slavery. So you have to hate it if you're a Massachusetts abolitionist. Sumner pronounced Kansas-Nebraska Act as both the worst and best thing ever. Why?
Acceleration is.
Yeah.
Get it going.
Yeah. It's the worst because it might allow the spread of slavery, but it's the best because, as you said, it accelerates the argument. It's picking a fight, which is what Sumner's about to do next week. He's gonna pick a fight, and it ain't gonna go well. It's not gonna go well for his skull. But we've seen this before in history, right? Those of you with the background in the American Revolution, Sam Adams said that about the Coercive Acts, if you remember. Sam Adams said, this is horrible, this is awful. However, it's fantastic. Because he said, what did the British do with the Coercive Acts? You finally overstepped and you upset people who weren't upset. Now I got you. Right? And it gives rise to one of my all-time favorite quotations from one of these historical figures. I wish people still talk like this. The whole thing about forcing a confrontation. Charles Sumner said, he's talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he said, thus it puts freedom and slavery face to face and bids them grapple. He's right. Bids them grapple. I've got to find a way to work that into a conversation. That's in my top 3 or 4. There was another one. Some of you remember from the American Revolution class. I remember if it was Nathaniel Greene or Benjamin Lincoln. One of the American generals in the South, after he won a battle against the British, where he really just wore them out, did a great job for the Americans. He wrote a letter to his wife. And in this letter, he told his wife, he said, something like, if by this defeat England is not taught a lesson, then she is an obstinate old slut. What did he say? Something like, bent upon her ruin or something. That's fantastic. I'm going to type that up and put it on my, well, no, I better not. Put that on my window. I hear from somebody. Yeah. Anyway, bids them grapple is a close second. I like that. Here's where it gets interesting. What is the Southern reaction? It's interesting on the Southern reaction as far as the law itself, they didn't, it's not that Southerners were celebrating it. They just kind of looked at it as vindication more than victory. Because I think you know this, especially if you're, think about all the Calhoun stuff. A lot of Southerners said, well, we've been telling you for 30 years that stupid line was illegal. There's nothing to celebrate, we're right. We always knew we were right. We're not dancing in the streets, we're just vindicated. Been telling you that. Plus that even though Douglas was a nationalist, and you'll see later when we get to the election, Douglas in '60 gets some Southern support, more than you might think, on like at local levels. But they didn't trust him. Southerners just couldn't quite trust him. I mean, he is a Yankee. But that's not the point. The Southerners say, look, besides the fact that in their opinion the line is and had always been illegal, the Southerners say it's a matter of principle. It's not about can slavery go there? Will it go there? Will it flourish? Will it fail? Who cares? So you're not going to tell us we can't go there. It's not about the money, it's about the principle. You will not dictate this. Right? Overall, significance, what does this take us? Well, I said a moment ago how, Kansas-Nebraska Act is the biggest legislative development. Let's elaborate on that a little bit. Why is it so important? Well, the first thing, the easy one right off the top, is that it reopens the debate on slavery expansion. Does it reopen the debate on slavery? Good gosh, they hadn't stopped talking about that. They're not gonna. It reopens the debate on expansion, meaning this. Well, let's look at the maps. This is where we were as of Compromise of 1850. Right? So, in the blue, slavery was legal. In the green, illegal. In the orange, where very few people lived, so it didn't really matter, popular sovereignty. The slavery debate was not over, but the slavery the debate with regard to where it can go was over. Well, now, you've erased this line. You've erased this line, and so now all of this is up for grabs. But most important, this right here is up for grabs. What will become Kansas? Right? So it looked like this in 50. Now it looks like this in 54. And yes, I know that whoever made this map does not know the difference between Maine and Illinois. Ignore that. This is the downside of stealing your sources from free web searches. Right? But I think this is the best and easiest map to read for Kansas, Nebraska. So now, slavery is legal here, it's illegal here, it's illegal here, it's up for grabs here, though no one cares. It's up for grabs here, and that's where people are about to start dying. Literally dying. Right. So that's the first point, as far as why is Kansas, Nebraska so important? It reopens the debate. Second, it begins a political realignment by leading to the creation of a brand new party called the Republicans. So what's going to happen is this new party comes along, and it's a little different in American history. It's not an east-west movement. It's a movement that goes from west to east. It starts in kind of like what you and I would call upper Midwest, Great Lakes area. You had a bunch of people up there, some Northern Democrats, a lot of Northern Whigs. They're so alienated and angry about the Kansas-Nebraska Act that they make their own party. They lose patience with the Whigs because the Whigs won't take a stand on anything. They lose patience with the Democrats because the Democrats are split between North and South, and so are constantly ducking and dodging the issue or relying on popular sovereignty. So these people who were so unhappy with the Kansas-Nebraska Act create their own party and ultimately settle on the name Republican, drawing on Jefferson is what they're trying to do, Democratic Republican. Jefferson, of course, author of the Declaration of Independence, Northwest Ordinance, anti-slavery legislation. This is the creation on paper of today's Republican Party. It's created as the anti-slavery party. Not abolitionist, but anti-slavery. At first, they were just calling themselves the anti-Nebraska Party. But the hell kind of name is that? It'd be the anti-Nebraska Party. So they become the Republican Party. The Whigs still hang around for a few years, but not as a major party. So this means over the next few years, you do have finally your Republicans against your Democrats. And the way it's going to break down is, at least for a while, There will be Democrats north and Democrats in the south, Republicans north only at the time. So the birth of the Republicans is the second reason it's so big, Kansas, Nebraska. The other reason Kansas-Nebraska Act is so big is it led to something you will read about, something called Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. I am not about to beat you to death with all these details. I have them, but I'm not going to do it. But I'm going to tell you the main idea. And that way when you read the book, it'll be easy to know what's going on. So the overview, the main idea with Bleeding Kansas is, as we just said, they've opened it up to popular sovereignty. Well, Kansas is right next to populated areas. It's good farmland. Everybody knows it. There's going to be competition for Kansas. And as we said last class period, popular sovereignty sounds good to some people. It's democracy in action. Leave it up to the settlers, right? What could be more democratic than that? But the problem is too important to too many people. It just won't, because nobody's willing to lose. Well, since it's popular sovereignty, the idea then is simply whoever wins the elections. And if the pro-slavery side wins the territorial elections, then they will write slavery into the Constitution. If the other side wins, they will write it out of the Constitution. Now keep in mind, look, it's not just pro-slavery against anti-slavery. It's pro-slavery against anti-slavery, but it's also pro-slavery against anti-slavery and the free soilers who just want Kansas to be white. Right? It's all of those people. What ends up happening, as you'll see in your readings, 100% predictable. Both sides cheated. I always phrase it that way. I always say it starts out with just some good old-fashioned American cheating. Right? Win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat. That was once said by a great American philosopher by the name of Ric Flair from my childhood. Yeah, there you go. Win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat. You'll see examples. Northerners were literally recruiting people to move to Kansas or travel to Kansas just to vote. There was an anti-slavery society in Massachusetts that literally rounded up people and shipped them to Kansas to vote. To be fair, the Southerners were cheating too. This is great. There's a great quotation. I mean, I don't know what they're doing is great. Put that on my door. But no, what this guy says is a great illustration of it. There was a senator from Missouri, obviously. Kansas and Missouri right next door. By the way, this is where the whole Kansas-Missouri rivalry starts with jayhawking and all that stuff. There was an super aggressive pro-slavery senator in Missouri right next door. This guy starts telling people and writing it and publishing it, just saying, hey, cross the border, go into Kansas and vote for slavery. And everybody's like, Senator, that's illegal. You don't live in Kansas. He said, doesn't matter. Go win the election. But here's what he says. Remember the whole thing with the Mormons, right? Missouri, covered all that?
Mm-hmm.
Here's what he wrote. These are his words, not mine. He says, we are organizing. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionists. That's good stuff. This turns out exactly like you think it would. Starts with cheating. Both sides have elections in which they say, well, we have the true government. Then it comes down to who will the feds recognize. And then they end up doing the elections over a couple times. And then unfortunately, as you'll see in your reading, the cheating escalates to violence, and both sides are guilty of violence as well. A couple of famous examples, what they call the sack of Lawrence. Lawrence, where KU is today. Lawrence was the kind of the headquarters of the Free State people. A bunch of pro-slavery guys rode in and just started killing people, burning the town, smashing the press, the newspaper press. The anti-slavery types did their thing as well. The famous, of course we're going to spend a ton of time later talking about John Brown, famous abolitionist who does something super famous in 1859. Well, before he became famous, John Brown, the abolitionist, became involved in leading Kansas. We're going to talk a lot about Brown. I'll tell you a ton about him later, but as some of you may remember, John Brown was not just an abolitionist, he's the abolitionist. This guy told anybody who would listen that God created him to destroy slavery. That is why it was born, he said. As far as why, I'll tell you all the details later. It's actually an interesting story. So he said, God sent me here. I'm going to go to Kansas. There will be no slavery in Kansas. So John Brown and some of his followers, they go down to southeastern Kansas, right across from what's now Oklahoma, a place called Potawatomi Creek. And to get his message across, John Brown and some of his followers, they took 5 men, 5 pro-slavery men, and took them out in the street in front of their families, killed them and chopped them into pieces with swords. Because God told him to do that. Right? Well, you'll see in the book what ends up happening. I don't want to bother you with all the votes and everything, but the controversy is the president eventually is the guy we'll talk about, James Buchanan, who's a northerner but sympathetic to the South, much like Pierce was. But Congress largely ends up on the side of the Free State. Eventually, they send in the federal military to supervise what was supposed to be a legit election, and the Free State people win by a massive amount. So, Kansas-Nebraska Act leads to all of that. I should mention a term. I should have mentioned it with Pierce. I'll mention it again under Buchanan when we get there. In case you see this word in your readings, the word doughface. Doughface. It's talked about a lot with James Buchanan, but it was also true of Franklin Pierce. Doughface was a term used in the 1850s for a northern politician who was sympathetic to the South. Not necessarily pro-Southern in terms of his views, but he's sympathetic to their right to be whatever they want to be. That was Pierce, and it was Buchanan. Right. If you ever get a chance to go through Kansas, by the way, there's really not a reason to go to Kansas, but if you do, the northern part of the state is actually interesting. Topeka and Lawrence, you can see the sites where a lot of this happened, some of the buildings where they did the voting and stuff that are still there. So if you ever get a chance to go. And KU is a really nice place. So go up there and look around. Okay, any questions? Okay, I emailed you the chapters for the 1850s book. If you didn't get that, check your email. I cut it way down. All right, I didn't send you a list of terms or questions because I looked at it. It's just kind of reinforcing what we do in class, so it's really just a textbook. All right, so you're really only reading about half of the Fire Eater's book and about half of that book. So, all right, check your email so you know those chapters.